Welcome to A Voice from Main Street. This time we are getting together with a guy who's having a voice on a Main Street after he was one of only 13 players to ever play in the NBA and major leagues. And we'll be talking next up with Mark Hendrickson, Voices on Main Street, here with Gary Sutton on podcast. And I'm joined today by Mark Hendrickson. And Mark Hendrickson, a lot of you may remember, I remember that guy. Big 6'9" guy, right? Washington State, he played in college. He was all Mr. Everything in his local area, all Mr. Everything in the Pac-10. He comes out of there. He ends up going and playing for the Sixers. He ends up playing baseball for the Toronto Blue Jays, one of only 13 guys to ever do that. And guess what? He's here today with me on Voices of Main Street. Mark, great to have you aboard, my friend.
Oh, it's great to see you. Great to spend time together.
We got together a few years ago. We used to talk a little bit when he was pitching here in York Township even for a while and with York Revolution. But, you think back to those days, and a lot of people say, I remember Mark Hendrickson. Where'd he go? Well, he's here, but we're going to talk about some of the things you're doing now, which are really spectacular and have the potential to really help kids out. But talk about when you got started. Back in those days in Washington, I think, you're a guy who, 6'9", a lot of people say, well, what are you going to do? You did an awful lot.
I'm an advocate of multiple sports. When I was a kid, that's just what we did. Whatever was in season, that's what I played. And for me, that was my elite gift. I said to you earlier, the eye-hand coordination, the ability to pick up any sport was something that was my attribute that was, in the excellent category. And so for me, that's just what I did. I kept playing. People thought because I went to college and played basketball that was my first love, and it wasn't. It's just where I was from. Most of my baseball was played in the summer due to weather. So for me, basketball was in the winter, baseball was in the summer, and every other sport was in between. So I started to come back here to Pennsylvania in the summers because they had pretty good amateur baseball. Right. That's something that we didn't have out there once you got into college. It was hard to find a league where you can continue to play. So I'd play my season at college at Washington State, my basketball season. Then I came back here starting to play baseball. And for me, it was important because I was playing with grown men. So say what you want about the skill sets and where they were at, but 30-year-old men, and I was competing against them, that was very beneficial for me. Just to learn how to deal with, older players and some of the nuances that they had learned over their careers, because a lot of them played in college. Central
League Baseball and Susquehanna League Baseball, pretty good here in the area at that time. And I remember first meeting you at Alberto's restaurant up there in Spry, and someone said, "This is Mark Hendrickson." I said, I knew who Mark Hendrickson was. I'd watched you play, and it's interesting this week we're talking as, March Madness gets started. I remember watching you play for Washington State. You guys did pretty well. You were all Pac-10 out there. You were MVP in high school. You won state championships. But I remember seeing you play then, maybe a little different now with the 64, but back then getting into those kind of tournaments, a big deal, right?
Oh, that was the best thing going, and still is the best thing going, because I think for a player and even a coach, you're always engaged in your entire season because you always have a chance. You can get hot at the right time here in March and earn a bid, and then once you get into the dance, ultimately, yes, there's some upsets that people like, but you don't argue the champion. The champion wins 6 in a row.
That's right.
So ultimately, it's the best team in that moment that wins, and I think that's what people fall in love with. And the average fan doing the brackets, thinking that they're able to pick and choose, and those are a lot of things that really just engage the public as a whole. So I think for the most part, it's a great tournament. It's a great opportunity, and for me, that was something I wanted to experience.
Mark, you're one of only 13 guys to ever play the NBA and the major leagues, and I'm sure you're asked about that all the time. But when it came time to choose both of those, not a lot of people get that choice. How did you make that choice? Tell people about the process you went through.
First off, I think a lot of people understand and kind of know me through my grandfather. And people in York who maybe aren't sports fans, I tell them he was a principal at Dallastown for 30 plus years. So a lot of people in the older generation, I remember your grandfather as a principal, and it, strict but fair is what I always got. And I remember him coming out to my house, and in high school, I had the first major decision. I already had a college scholarship to Washington State. Atlanta Braves picked me up, and they were in my house trying to get me to sign. I had watched other two-sport athletes in the previous, say 5 years that made a decision to go play and then continue their basketball journey. And my grandfather was like, no, that's not happening. You're going to school, you're getting your education, and you want to control your rights. He goes, you go to the summer, you sign, they work the contract that you can go play basketball, but ultimately they're still now controlling your rights. And he was a big proponent of me going to college. And it was honestly the best experience I had. As an 18-year-old kid, getting that structure when you go to college, that's one of the benefits that you have when you're on scholarship. Everybody's taking care of everything that you have to make sure that you're performing, up to the standards that you need to so that you can play. And so for me, that was kind of the first decision. And then people are kind of surprised when I say this. I got drafted 6 times.
Yep.
And most people are like, 6? How did that happen? I didn't play baseball my first 2 years of college. So the rule is if you were a baseball player and went to college, you weren't able to get drafted till after your junior year. So I kept getting drafted. It was just kind of like keeping my rights just in case. Nobody was really pursuing me very seriously. Then after my junior year, I decided to go out and play. So then I got drafted again. And the last time that it was really serious was with Toronto. And they had dealt with some 2-sport athletes before. And they were totally fine with me coming out after the basketball season. So what I would do is after my year, we had negotiated a contract after my second year with the Sacramento Kings. I had took 1 week off and then I went to extended spring training. Got myself ready and then jumped into high A, double A. And honestly, mentally coming from the NBA, I could compete at those levels. My skills may have been not as good as those players, but mentally what I had been through, I was able to compete. And as I progressed up the ladder in the minor leagues, I got to a point where they invited me to the Fall League. And the Fall League is the Arizona Fall League for prospects. And it's something that each team sends out 3 or 4 prospects. And it's a very elite Fall League for the top prospects in baseball. And so when I got that invitation, my agent in baseball was kind of like, hey, you can't really turn this down. And so I went out there, had a good experience, got to a point in the process where I was not protected on the 40-man because after 3 years in an organization, they've got to kind of put you in a level. And nobody picked me up in a Rule 5 draft. So then ultimately, basketball was kind of in and out, trying to establish myself as a player. And finally, I just said, okay, they didn't pick me. They didn't protect me. Nobody picked me up. So I got to commit. So I committed to baseball full-time. Year and a half later, I was up in the big leagues.
Played for the Sixers also. You got drafted there and played as well. You also played for a guy, we're talking about March Madness, who has a number 1 seeded team in the tournament this year, Kelvin Sampson. And you said there's a guy that helped to shape your life. Talk about that.
Oh, without a doubt. Because like most high school athletes, I was, I step on the court and I had success just because I was a better player than most high school athletes. And when I got to college, I really struggled because the competition had picked up. I was the first time I was away from home. And I was struggling with my confidence. I remember within 3 weeks, I had to go into the office. And that was not something I was looking forward to because here I am, top prospect, and now I'm struggling with my confidence. And, that moment changed my life. The fact that I had a male role model tell me he believed in me and he was going to win with me and lose with me was something that it's what I needed to hear. And I can't say enough about Kelvin Sampson. For the guy who's been in coaching for as long as he has, he has an innate ability to bring out the best in 18 to 22-year-olds. And that is something that if you look at how the college landscape has changed, there's one constant. His teams are playing the same way that we used to play when he was at Washington State. And it's always going to give his teams a chance to win. And I am rooting so much for him to finally get that national championship because he deserves it. And they have a really good team this year.
You talk about you as a pitcher. How have things changed in the majors since you pitched during that time? Because you weren't one of these guys that was throwing 100 miles an hour. You were throwing about 90, 91. You were known as a great control pitcher. You pitched a year for the Orioles, I know, toward the end. You pitched a year for the Revolution as well. But talk a little bit about how things have changed from then till now in terms of pitching in the major leagues.
Analytics has played a big part in sports. And I think the pendulum, when that first came out, swung more so to that versus the reality of, hey, we're human beings playing baseball and playing basketball and various sports. And so a lot of things in baseball, you got to remember, it's an entertainment, so they're going to value certain things. And I think players are just going to adapt to it. And what you're seeing in baseball is guys are now trying to throw as hard as they can. Figure that's where the money's at. Same thing with the hitters. Hitters are thinking, hey, more home runs. Who cares about the strikeout? We want to have home runs and entertainment. And it seems to work as far as bringing in the fan base. But I think ultimately from a pitcher standpoint, the part that's kind of scary is I've heard stories that high school athletes will get Tommy John voluntarily.
I was going to say Tommy John is what we mention all the time now, getting that shoulder reconstructed, and it's crazy.
They're like, eventually it's going to happen. And I'm like, the human body's not meant to be opened up. That's like the last resort. Why are you voluntarily doing that? I think it's a short-sighted mindset. You know, when I got into professional sports, I had a short-sighted mindset, but I also had a long-term goal. And for me, it was always like, okay, I want to play till I'm 40 at least, and then I'll decide what I want to do after that. And people got to understand, as the body changes, the wear and tear, and your body just naturally ages, you've got to adapt. I've said this many, many times. You have to have some kind of ego to make it in sports because you have so much failure you deal with. But I think what athletes don't understand is the ego is the first thing that will drive them out of the sport just as fast. Because if you're not willing to look in the mirror, evaluate, adjust, you're not going to last because it's the best of the best. And so they're not only great athletes, but they have all the technology. Even as a pitcher nowadays, they can go into the dugout. And I've told this to younger pitchers. They've watched their previous at bat against you 4 or 5 times already. And you've got to remember, as a pitcher, you're facing 1 through 9. Well, guess what? He's been waiting 8 hitters to get his chance. So when he steps in that box, that's his time to earn his money. So he's going to be focused. You as a pitcher have just faced the previous hitter, and you've got to lock in. And a lot of times that little slip up can hurt you as a pitcher.
You also talk as a pitcher now. I'm always interested now, first time through, second time through, third time through. How do you adjust as a pitcher when you're seeing a guy? Do you save a little something for someone that you didn't show the first time? Do you ever get that heady about it?
I've always analyzed how I pitched them. I'm always looking at the pitch chart just to see what I've thrown, because here's kind of the cat and mouse game. You face guys long enough. They know what you have. You know what they have.
Right.
It's, do you make the adjustment before you have to? Because you know what? Sometimes that's where it's kind of tricky, because if you get a guy out a certain way, the good hitters will come up looking for it. Other hitters will continue because they have a hole. And so as you develop, and as I developed as an athlete, you know, at least from a baseball standpoint, you learn people's tendencies. And you're able to make that adjustment to kind of say, hey, I'm going to play to my strengths, but I'm also going to maybe perhaps play to their weaknesses.
Dave Johnson was telling me one time, he's a friend of mine, I play some golf with him, and Dave pitched for the Orioles for a few years, and said, I always tried to throw them the pitch that they weren't looking for. If they thought it was a fastball, I'd throw a curve. If I thought it was going to be a curveball, I'd throw a fastball. He said, I only had an 85-mile-an-hour fastball, so he said, I couldn't be a Felix Bautista throwing 100 miles past him. And it's interesting to hear different guys talk about the thinking part of the game. And what you're saying right here sounds so true.
It plays into it. I think a lot of it is knowing yourself as a pitcher too, right? Because ultimately they'll say, hey, I'd rather take the wrong pitch 100% committed than the right pitch with hesitation. And ultimately, baseball is such a unique sport in that way, because technically, if you ask a hitter or a pitcher, you know, once we let go of the baseball as a pitcher, I've seen hitters squared up and it goes right to a player for an out. And they also then hit the bleeders that fall in for a hit.
Right.
So it's a very unique game in the sense that you really don't have as much control as you think you do, because I've had many, many hitters come in the dugout on my team that are just livid. They just squared up the baseball, but it's an out. And stats matter. And so I try to change the perspective with them and say, hey, look, if you knew you could square up every baseball you ever hit, would you take your chances? And they're like, yeah, of course. It's hard to live in that moment when you just squared one up and it's an 0 for 1. You know, that's the challenge in baseball.
You go from basketball and baseball, you become a husband, you become a father, and now you've started something called Play Up Athletes. Let's talk a little bit about where you're at now, because that's just every bit as important to you as I know it was back then in your career, and that's kind of set the table for where you're at right now. Talk a little bit about your life, your family, and also Play Up, because I know you've got some big things going on with that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I got to tell you, the last time I was on a basketball court was in the NBA with New Jersey Nets. And the time in between, I come in, I start coaching 3rd grade girls. You can't get a bigger gap than that.
No.
And it's interesting because I'm like, you know what? I want to coach one of my daughters. So I've got 4 daughters. So for me, a lot of lessons have been learned kind of in the doghouse, because growing up in a very dominant male atmosphere, and there's no more dominant space than a locker room.
Well, if you had your wife there too, you got a whole team against you. So
I've
that's
got
tough.
Girls all around me, and they make me a better man for sure. But it's been a lot of trial and error for me. But growing up, you know, watching them and being a part of their experience, and I think for me having I told you before, if I was a better athlete, I don't know if I would have played 2 sports. And most people are going to listen to this and go, wait a minute, you just played at the highest level. But I'm looking through a lens of the elite of the elite. And I never had superior skills in either one of the sports. Like I said earlier, my eye-hand coordination was my gift. But going through that and having experienced that much for as long as I have, I realized some of the things that even professional athletes are missing. And a lot of it is just that preparation mentally, having those high performance habits. And I see it in today's youth because everything is kind of swung to these spring, summer leagues, in basketball it's AAU. I don't know exactly what they want to call it in other sports, but these kids are playing a ton of sports, and I don't know if it's making them better athletes because ultimately they're doing the physical part, but they're lacking some of the other stuff, the physical training, the mental training, the nutrition, all these things that I think are so valuable for today's young athletes that it's just kind of following the herd. Hey, everybody's doing this, so we're going to go ahead and do this. And you see so many bad habits being formed. And I think for me, it's markahendrickson.com is my website to start. Ultimately, it's going to go into play up athletes. But for me, it's just an opportunity to speak to young kids, to do some consulting work with coaches, and also my certification that I recently got in high performance. It's trying to give and shorten that learning curve for the next generation of athletes. Because what good am I, having played 2 sports, gone through it, experienced what I have, if I can't pay it forward? Then it's kind of like I'm not taking the blessings that God gave me and using it for good. So that's my plan moving forward. And I think it's been brought really out with coaching my daughter's team because I'm like, okay, how am I going to teach these girls the games? And they're not all elite athletes. They're not going to be. But it's interesting because the more I teach and the more I watch other youth coaches, I'm like, what are they doing? In my situation, I'm a grown man. I cannot be yelling at girls.
Right.
How are they going to perform? They're not going to perform. Gino Ariema has said it best. He goes, you cannot coach girls and boys the same way.
No, you can't.
And I think a lot of people lose sight of that. And they really are forgetting it. In today's world, it's about teaching. Are we teaching? And I think the one thing that I'm proud of as far as being associated with a tremendous program here in the county at York Suburban, Jess Weaver, head coach of the girls program, does a great job 12 on
really
down
Yep.
of really building a program. And if you ever go and get a chance to watch one of her teams play, they play together, they play hard, good team ball. And I think it's something that the next 5 or 6 years, people are going to notice in this county. It's a really good program. And it really is teaching girls to play the game the right way. And I'm not saying other schools don't do it, but it's just something you see throughout their program. And that's just what I'm a part of as well, in coaching my daughters.
When you think about coaching, what are the most important aspects of coaching? Now, you've been coached by some of the very best. Obviously, you talk about Coach Sampson. You've played with some of the best. But when you think about the components of coaching, and I've done this for 45 years myself, so I'm always interested from a player standpoint what you're thinking on a guy that's coached some. What are the most important components to you as a player? What best resonated with you as a player from coaches?
It's funny we say coaches, but I think for anybody outside of the sports world, leadership. How are you going to lead? If you're in a company, you got to be able to lead and elevate, people to be their best. And I think ultimately, from my standpoint as a coach, I think you have to adapt to some of your players. You have to know the personalities of each player of what you can do. You can't coach them all the same.
Nope.
Yes, a certain style of play you can have players adapt to. But ultimately, I think especially in the professional world, when you get to professional sports, players have now elevated to their, a brand. And how do coaches manage all those brands? And I think the outside influences really play a part. And I think if a coach can get the best out of players and the chemistry is great, that's the separator in pro sports. Talent, I've been on very talented teams that had no chemistry and had no leadership where you're pushing the right buttons. I think one of the managers that I had that really stood out when he first got a head coach was down in Tampa Bay, Joe Madden. Love Joe. He sat in, he basically got some veterans on the team. He came in, he collectively had a meeting with us, and he said, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a code of conduct that we're going to come up with together. He goes, I got 2 things. Play hard, show up on time. Let's figure out the
Pretty
rest.
simple.
And so the players were like, oh, okay. And we bought into that. And if you've watched Joe Madden's career as a manager, very, very successful, what you deem as a player's manager, but it's because he had that respect to say, hey, look, I'm going to ask a lot, but I want you guys so we can collaborate. And that's very, it's kind of like a leadership team. You can't really do that in a business with everybody, but if you have a leadership team, you can do that. I can't suggest that a college coach is going to come in and collaborate with college kids because you might get a whole lot of crazy answers. But for that level, that was tremendous.
You're getting in front of a lot of athletic directors now. You're getting in front of coaches. What's the message to them? What are you telling them?
I think it's opening their eyes to what young kids need. That's the important thing. It's really kind of shortening that learning curve because, like I said, they're so used to trying to figure out the sport from a physical standpoint, they don't realize all the other things. One story that was kind of funny in Baltimore when I was coaching the A-ball team, a lot of kids would play catch at 3:00 in the afternoon, and they were lighting up. They were playing catch, throwing hard. I go, what are you doing? Oh, I got to get right. I got to get right. And I was like, it's 3:00 in the afternoon.
Right.
Like, you can't keep going throwing this hard in the afternoon. Nobody cares. Look around. Nobody's in the stadium. And I pointed out to the mound. I said, that's all they care about. It's what you do there. And then it's about recovery so you can go back out there and do it again. So one day I took the balls out. I said, we're done. And the look, I mean, these were guys who had to get right physically to be right mentally. And I said, oh boy, we're gonna have to reteach that because it's just not gonna work in professional sports. It's a war of attrition. Your job it's hard enough to do it once or twice, but now you're doing it for 6 months in a row, And so that's the thing I see with youth. So much on the physical part that if it's not right, and I was the same way. I mean, I was a starter. And if I didn't have day one go a certain way, I was messed up for my start that was 4 days later. It was completely just mechanical on the physical preparation. And the older I got, the more you realized that's not going to do it.
Final question. What's your goal at the end of the day now as Mark Hendrickson? Now, no longer Mark Hendrickson, the shooter, Mark Hendrickson, the pitcher, Mark Hendrickson, the athlete, but Mark Hendrickson, the teacher. What's your ultimate goal?
My lifestyle, I'm an athlete. And to me, that is one thing I ask the kids that play. Are you an athlete? Are you somebody that plays sports? If you're an athlete, it's a lifestyle. And that applies to anybody. Our bodies are meant to move. My goal is to help 1 million athletes by 2034. That's my goal, whether it's through speaking, consulting, my high-performance coaching. It's a big goal, but also playing in both the NBA and MLB was a big goal too. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity going up to the Pennsylvania State Athletic Directors Conference here after we speak. So I'm looking forward to getting in front of them to kind of see, hey, what do your students need? That's the biggest thing, solving a problem that today's students and student athletes need.
And Mark, again, where can people contact you now to find out more about what you're doing?
MarkAHendrickson.com is my website. All the information is on there. You can reach out, join my community, opt in with your email, and then we'll do a high-performance tip of the week that is just some insight that kids can use and build a community there where ultimately they get a chance to kind of touch a professional athlete and use my knowledge to help them in their athletic career.
Thanks a lot, my friend. I appreciate it.
All right, good seeing you.
One of the great voices out on Main Street right now, Mark Hendrickson, helping kids, helping people who want to be athletes and experience all of what that brings with it. I'm Gary Sutton. Thanks for joining us here on A Voice on Main Street.